Hi, the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian here. Well, it's the early part of July. We have not taken a look at the sun in the past several weeks. I thought it would be a good time to do that. The sun, of course, is crucially important. It's a principal driver of all weather and climate. This is well into solar cycle 24 now. We are more than 4 years into this particular solar cycle, and this was supposed to be a very active time for this particular solar cycle. Many solar scientists predicted the solar maximum would occur in the middle or latter part of 2013. It's looking more and more likely that perhaps the solar maximum for this particular cycle occurred at the end of 2011. It's been relatively quiet over the past few weeks. However, the last 24 to 48 hours or so has seen the emergence of quite a large sunspot region right here. This is the very latest solar image, and this particular sunspot region, officially known as AR 1785, actually generated a solar flare earlier today. However, that should not affect the Earth's upper atmosphere, as we were not in the line of fire. As this rotates over the next several days in this fashion, it will become certainly more directly facing the Earth, and any additional solar flare over the next several days could have an impact on the Earth's upper atmosphere. So again, other than that particular sunspot region, it's rather quiet on the sun, and all in all, this particular year has been rather subdued. We are still on pace for this particular solar cycle to be the weakest solar cycle in over 100 years, since solar cycle 14 peaked back in 1906. This is continuing a trend of weaker and weaker solar cycles dating back 2 or 3 decades, and we'll get more into that over the next few minutes. Well, here's kind of a longer range look at this particular solar cycle as well as the previous solar cycle, number 23. Here we stand right here, and again, a lot of solar scientists predicted that this particular part of solar cycle 24, the middle, latter part of 2013, would be the solar maximum time period, but it's looking more and more likely that the solar maximum for this particular current solar cycle may actually have occurred back here in the latter part of 2011. There's also the thought that perhaps there can be a double peak in solar cycle 24, meaning it might get quite active in the latter part of 2013 or the early part of 2014, but right now it does not look like the solar maximum is going to occur at this particular time period that we're in here in the middle part of 2013. Again, there's a growing belief that the solar maximum may have occurred back here in 2011. Now again, we have an active sunspot region right now emerging on the sun, so we'll of course continue to monitor this over the next several weeks and months. Now, a couple things I want to point out here. Notice this particular solar cycle is weaker than the last one, and that continues a trend of weaker and weaker solar cycles. The last one was weaker than the prior one that peaked back in 1990. Now, what do I mean by a weak solar cycle? That means fewer and fewer sunspots, fewer and fewer solar flares. So again, we're in a trend here of 3 different solar cycles now that are weaker and weaker, and there are some solar scientists that are already predicting the next solar cycle, number 25, will actually be weaker than this current solar cycle, number 24. Another thing I want to point out here, the predictions are now that this particular solar cycle may extend all the way to the latter part of this decade or perhaps the early part of the next decade. Why is that important? Well, some studies have shown that the length of the solar cycle has a direct impact on global temperatures. The longer the solar cycle, the cooler the global temperatures. And the weaker the solar cycle, some studies have shown the cooler the global temperature. So the combination of a weak solar cycle and an extended solar cycle certainly can lead to cooler global temperatures over the next 5, 10, 15 years or so. Well, here's kind of an even longer range look at solar cycles. Again, we are in a downward trend here. This is the 3rd solar cycle now that is weaker than the prior one. Right here is where we stand, solar cycle 24. 23 peaked at around the year 2000, solar cycle 22 around 1990, and again the prediction for the next solar cycle by some solar scientists is that solar cycle 25 will be even weaker than this current solar cycle. This one right here that we're in right now, solar cycle 24, is on pace to be the weakest one since solar cycle 14, which is shown right here, that peaked in around the year 1906. Well, why do we care about how strong the solar cycle is? Well, again, a lot of research has shown that the weaker the solar cycle, perhaps the cooler the global temperatures are. And again, there's some studies that show that the length of the solar cycle has a direct impact on global temperatures as well. In fact, in the past, there have been a couple of periods here in relatively modern times here. This is a particular map that goes all the way back 400 years of sunspot observations. And back in what is called the Maunder minimum period, there are several decades of weak solar cycles, very little in the way of sunspot activity, perhaps 40 or 50 years or so, 5 decades or so of weak solar cycles. And that was a cold period, globally speaking, is known as the Little Ice Age. Another weak period called the Dalton minimum occurred with weak solar cycles back in the middle and latter part of the 1800s. Again, a cold period, globally speaking. So it's quite important to monitor what's going on in the sun with respect to global temperatures. And again, we are now in a weaker and weaker cycle here, seemingly a weaker and weaker cycle for solar sunspot cycles, and we'll see what happens over the next several months with respect to solar cycle 24, and then for the next several years for the next solar cycle, number 25. Well, one of the interesting aspects of the weaker and weaker solar cycle phase that we seem to be in right now is that it seems to be correlated with a cold phase of the northern Pacific Ocean. Again, we talked earlier up front in this video about the importance of the sun and oceanic cycles. Pacific Ocean, perhaps the most important of all the oceans, since it's the largest ocean by far. In just several years ago, the northern Pacific slipped into a cold or negative phase. We track that with an index called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, seen right here in blue. When it's negative, the northern Pacific is colder than normal in terms of sea surface temperatures. So we are now in a cold phase, at least in terms of the northern Pacific. At the same time, we have these weaker and weaker solar cycles. Could that have an effect on global temperatures? Well, indeed, there's some evidence that over the last few years, global temperatures have actually trended downward. In fact, let's take a look at that right now. Well, here's a chart of the global 2-meter temperature anomalies going back to January of 2009, put together by Dr. Ryan Maui at weatherbell.com. And the general trend over that time period is generally on a downward trend here in terms of global temperature anomalies. Could that be because of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation slipping into that negative phase, or perhaps related to the weaker and weaker solar cycles, or perhaps a combination of the two? Well, that is certainly a possibility. All of the above are possibilities, and we will, of course, continue to monitor all of this over the next several weeks and months to come in terms of the solar cycles, the oceanic cycles, and the global temperature anomalies. Again, this particular chart put together using the NOAA's CFS Coupled Forecast System model. It's the global temperature anomalies over the last several years, since about the time the Pacific Ocean slipped into a negative phase, from weatherbell.com. That's it for now, so stay tuned to the siweather.com over the next several weeks and months, and we'll continue to monitor all of this. Again, there is an active sunspot region right now rotating into the line of fire, putting the Earth into the line of fire over the next several days, AR 1785, and we'll, of course, monitor that as well over the next few days. That's it for now for the siweather.com. I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.